Glimpses of Eternity, the first work to explore shared death experiences, common but mysterious experiences of family and friends sharing a loved one's journey from this life to the next. Of course, Dr. Raymond Moody with us, and we're going to be talking with him about this along with Dr. John Turner right here on Coast to Coast AM. And both of our guests have been on the program before. Of course, the esteemed Dr. Raymond Moody. He is the foremost expert on the phenomenon of near-death experiences, as well as a compelling lecture on the subjects of evocation of the deceased, cult activities, out-of-body experiences, and the paranormal. Here's Dr. Raymond Moody. Raymond, how are you? Welcome back.
All right, George. How are you doing?
I'm
It's so
doing
good
great.
to hear you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this tonight.
Me
Of
too.
course, we've got John Turner with us, serving as the first neurosurgeon on the big island of Hawaii. He arrived with the desire to investigate the spiritual world and understand the meaning of life, death, and life after death. And during his career as a board-certified neurosurgeon, curiosity drove him to explore non-traditional healing techniques that broaden the scope of recovery for his patients. Here's Dr. John Turner back on Coast to Coast. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, good evening, George, and thank you again for allowing me to be here. And thank you, Raymond. Good morning to you. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
Likewise, John. Thank you so much for all your help. This has been so nice.
Oh, you're
Looking
welcome.
forward to this. And, John, by the way, I think I'm going to build a little studio on the Big Island as well. You know, between St. Louis and L.A., I think I'm going to put one in Hawaii in the next 6 months or so.
I think you need to do that, George. This is paradise.
Give us a little broader coverage all over the place. It sure is. Anyway, John, tell me a little bit about your work with Dr. Moody.
Well, you know, I work for Dr. Moody. Let me correct that a bit. Dr. Moody's work had inspired me way back when Life After Life was first published. That and the work of Edgar Cayce were instrumental in my search for this afterlife and what really happens when we die. And I know, George, you've been very interested in this. As I follow your shows, the topic always comes up.
Yeah.
And this, I think, tonight, I think what we're going to discuss is going to give people a lot of hope. And we're going to present the closest thing that I know to proof, which are the shared death experiences that we'll talk about. But in a nutshell, this is what happened. I was doing filming a year or more ago of a documentary called Spirit. And on my website blog, you can see about all these things. But during a break in the filming, Viv Summers, the director and producer, was listening to me talk about my wish to go to Brazil to study John of God and to experience that whole healing phenomenon. And I was going to meet the great opera star Stephen Salters there just to experience it. And then suddenly Viv said, well, I want to go too. And that led to an expedition plan to go down there as well as a TV project. And over the next year, as we worked hard for this TV project, we were about ready to begin this next year. The Luminary Lecture Series featuring Dr. Raymond Moody as the first speaker came up. These will be held early next year. They'll start. And as a result, I was asked to work for Dr. Moody and trying to promote his great work because I tell you, George, as you're going to learn tonight as we discuss the brain and these experiences, that the shared death experiences are going to make non-believers believers. So this is what happened over the last year and a half since I last talked to you, George. Amazing things have happened. And now I have the great honor of being with the father of near-death experiences. It's just tremendous.
Raymond, we've talked about this before, but we get a lot of brand new listeners to the program. And, of course, you are at the forefront of near-death experience research. Tell us how you first got involved in this.
Well, George, fortunately, I was the very last person who you would expect would get interested in something like that, which is, I think, in terms of any strength that I have as a researcher, it really comes from the fact that I didn't come from a religious family. My dad was hardened military person from World War II. He had been a medic and a surgeon in the Pacific Theater. And, that generation, as you know, didn't talk about things. So it was a long time before I realized he must have had some really horrific experiences in World War II. So anyway, when he came back home after World War II, he was just very, very sour on religion. And so I just didn't grow up a religious person. And So I got interested in astronomy at about the age of 7, and which is still one of my big passions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had pretty much decided at an early age from my study of science and so on that what happens when you die is that your body just rots and your consciousness goes to zero. And that belief was really, really very deeply implanted in me. And one thing I've noticed both as a psychiatrist and as a human being over the years is that the ideas that you develop as a child are really kind of hard to overcome. In other words, that they sort of stay with you in a very deep way. Well, anyway, in high school I got interested in philosophy as well, but then at age 18 I went off to the University of Virginia. This was in 1962. And my intention was to go on to get a Ph.D. in philosophy, but in my first few days at UVA, I took a philosophy course my first semester, and in my first few days at UVA, reading Plato's Republic, I decided I was going to be a philosophy major, and Plato is still one of my great heroes of life, and anyway, toward the end of the Republic, there's this story about a warrior, who gets apparently killed and is believed dead on the battlefield. But during the funeral ceremony, he sits up and he sort of revives, and to his friend's astonishment, starts talking about this voyage he had into another dimension beyond life. Well, I heard some other stories like that from ancient Greek philosophers, and actually the study of near-death experiences was one of the big focal points of early Greek philosophy, which, as you know, really formed the entire Western intellectual tradition. But anyway, in my third year at UVA, one of my philosophy professors told me that right there in Charlottesville at the medical school was Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry, who some years before had been pronounced dead for an amazing length of time, at least 9 minutes.
Oh, that is long.
And during that time had an astonishing experience. And George Ritchie was very open to talking with students, so very soon thereafter I heard him talk about his experience to a group of students. It just overwhelmed me. Then I went on and 4 more years got my Ph.D. in philosophy at UVA, and in 1969 started to teaching philosophy at a university, and in that context heard a lot from my students who had been through this experience, then began to lecture to civic clubs around town, heard these same stories from the prominent business people in town, and then, to make a long story short, since that time, especially once I got to medical school in 72 and started hearing a lot of these stories from patients, have had the very great honor of literally talking with thousands of people from all over the world who've been to the brink of death and got revived and had these astonishing stories of what happened to them afterward.
Let's talk about some of these experiences, Raymond, of near-death experiences. What are some of the top ones on your research list?
Well, basically what we find, and this has actually been confirmed now by physicians pretty much all over the world, and that is that there's this common pattern, and that is that people will tell us, for example, that at the point where they almost died, where their heart stops beating, that they tell us that they seem to slip out of their body, they rise up, they witness the scene of the resuscitation from a point of view above. They tell us they can actually see their own physical bodies down below being resuscitated. After a while in this, they move through a passageway, which they compare to a tunnel, into a brilliant and beautiful light, they say far brighter than anything we have ever experienced while we're alive, and yet full of complete comfort and peace, joy. People say this light is almost permeated by love far greater than any of us have experienced while we're alive. In that light, they talk about seeing relatives or friends of theirs who have passed away, who seem to be there almost in the role of a greeting committee to help them across. And they tell us of panoramic memory, in which they say that in many cases, every single detail of their lives is displayed around them in this instantaneous, three-dimensional, holographic panorama. They say everything you've ever done is reviewed right there in front of you in full color and 3 dimensions. And during this experience, people say that they typically don't watch the action from the point of view they had when they were doing each action, but rather when the action has its consequence, they are embedded in the consciousness of those with whom they've interacted. And hence, if you see yourself doing a mean-spirited action to somebody in this panorama, then you feel the hurt that you brought about in that person's life. Or if you see yourself doing kind-hearted actions, then you feel the good feelings you brought about.
Right, and they're dramatic. And John, you as a neurosurgeon, how do we know that some of these experiences aren't some kind of glitch in the brain?
Well, by glitch, George, I think, for example, you mean some type of chemical release, perhaps?
Chemical release, something natural that happens at the moment of near death?
Well, let's talk about that. First, the chemical release has been studied a lot. And much of what I learned, I found in a couple of great books by Pim Van Lommel, The Consciousness Beyond Life, and Chris Carter's new book, Science in the Near-Death Experience. Both of these books do guide someone to where to look for this kind of information. But ketamine is one drug that was explored long ago. It was used as an anesthetic, and it produces a dissociation reaction. People kind of dissociate from their bodies. And John Lilly experimented with this quite a bit. And a lot of people will see these visions, certain things, but none of the things are reproducing what Raymond has just discussed, this panoramic life review, for example, the life-changing experience of going through these. So ketamine is one drug that doesn't seem to be some chemical released in the brain. Another one that I think you and I talked about, George, a year and a half ago is DMT.
Yes.
And that, Dr. Strassman feels, is released by the pineal gland. And again, this is a whole other subject about the pineal being the trapdoor to the soul and all that. But when that is taken or given intravenously, it transports the individual almost instantaneously to a parallel universe, an altered state in which they quite often view other beings working on high-tech equipment. It's very strange. But that could account for the bright light experience if indeed the pineal releases this into the cerebral spinal fluid that's right directly adjacent to an area we call the collicular plate. And that's a connection for auditory and visual connections there. So if it was released, Strassman could be right. It could give us that bright light experience, but it certainly doesn't account for everything else.
This connection, is it something that is microscopic, or is it?
No, this connection is this area, this quadrigeminal plate, physically looks like maybe half a postage stamp size area in the upper brainstem below the pineal that has 4 little humps, and But anyway, we know that that's where these connections are from our experimentation. Now, what else, George and Raymond? There's this lack of oxygen. People have said this is a phenomenon of a dying brain. But in experiments on medical students and high-altitude climbers, when oxygen deprivation is a factor, this produces disorientation and a certain laziness. And this is quite different than the near-death experience, where people are very clear in their thought, in their hearing, in their vision. And some people describe this, is this not correct, Raymond, as the most lucid and clear they've ever been. So when people begin to lose this oxygen in their breathing, they eventually will pass out. They don't have these other experiences, so that doesn't work. The high carbon dioxide is another theory that people bring up, and again, in resuscitation cases where oxygen and carbon dioxide are measured, they found that the carbon dioxide levels are about the same, and the oxygen levels are higher, actually, in many of those who have had the near-death experience. So all of this falls by the wayside. And in a shared death experience, which Dr. Moody will expound upon, these people in attendance do not have any injured brain. They don't have a lack of oxygen or increased carbon dioxide, and yet they're able to share in these same experiences as the one who is passing. And to me, this is the closest proof as we're ever going to have.
Interesting. And Raymond, through all of this, you talk about an alternative geometry in some near-death experiences. What does that mean?
Yes. Well, George, I absolutely have to second there what John has just said. And I think that this adding the findings about the shared death experience to what we already know about near-death experiences really has got to totally shift the landscape of the debate now, because we know very well, and I can absolutely assure you here that there is a tidal wave now, George, of what we call empathic death experiences or shared death experiences, which are identically the same phenomenon as what we now know as a near-death experience, except it occurs not to somebody who almost dies and returns, but rather to the bystanders standing around. And every single element that we identify as characteristic of a near-death experience is also reported in many cases by bystanders. And this includes, for example, bystanders who tell us that as their loved one in the bed died, they saw the spirit of the deceased person rise up, often in the form of a transparent replica of the person or of a golden cloud that leaves the body.
And I bet you get a lot of testimony, Raymond, from nurses and doctors who are
yes,
attending.
And George, that was the first one of these I heard was from one of my own medical school professors in 1972, who described getting out of her own body and going partway toward this light with her mother, who she had unsuccessfully tried to resuscitate. And back in the early 70s through the early 80s and on into the mid-80s, I was hearing these mostly from doctors and nurses. And then what happened is that there's been a total change in the hospital practice recently, or the past. Recently to somebody at age 66 means, roughly within the last 20 years, but more recently, and what's happened is there's been this major change in hospital practice, whereas when I went to medical school, when the patient was dying, it was the custom for doctors and nurses to come in and sort of escort the patient's family out on the theory that this would be too overwhelming.
Right. They wanted them long gone, didn't they?
Exactly. And then just that began to change. And now, here in 2010, the custom is almost entirely the reverse, that that the doctors and nurses try to make themselves scarce and encourage the families to be there to the very end. Well, I've seen along with this a concomitant shift from, whereas in the early 70s, through the 80s, I was hearing these mostly from doctors and nurses. Now I hear them predominantly from the loved ones who are there at the bedside of their dying family members.
Raymond, we're going to take this quick break, but we'll come back and talk more about this with Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. John Turner. The latest work, Glimpses of Eternity, by Dr. Raymond Moody with Paul Perry. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. We're with Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. John Turner. Raymond, we were talking about how the death experience is being shared now by a loved one, by a doctor, by a nurse, that they just seem to be able to share this. How does this happen?
Well, George, if you've got the answer to that one, let me know right away.
Really?
But I tell you, this is something, George, that's going to really totally change the debate, because it's in this kind of society, it's superficially plausible to say about the near-death experiences when somebody almost dies and their oxygen gets cut off to the brain and so on. There's a surface plausibility in saying that the experience was caused by the diminished oxygen flow creating a hallucination or whatever. But if the same phenomenon is reported in every detail, George, by the people standing around whose impression is or feeling is that they partially accompany their dying loved one to the other side. For example, I have many cases of people saying that when a loved one died in the bed, that the bystanders themselves feel like they get out of their body, they go part way toward this light with the dying loved one. People will tell me that as their loved one dies, the room fills up with this extraordinary light that permeates everything. As you mentioned earlier, a common thing I hear is that people say in some indescribable way that the whole geometry of the room changed, rather than finding themselves in the cubicle shape or the rectangular solid shape of a hospital room. The room seemed to distort in its shape and often seems to form up into a sort of hourglass shape. People will say that they hear heavenly music that seems to be coming from nowhere. I hear lots of cases in which people say that as their loved one dies, they perceive the spirits of the deceased relatives and friends of the person who's dying seem to come to meet the person who's just died. And most incredibly of all to me, George, this is one that just really is astonishing, but I have a number of cases, quite a number of cases, in which some person standing by empathically co-lives the panoramic life review of the person who's dead.
That's phenomenal.
And now, what is going on here? Basically, you've known me for a long time, and you've known that I'm just very reluctant to draw the conclusion that there's an afterlife, since it was not in my background. It's a very difficult thing for me to put together for myself, and yet...
Well, that's what makes you so credible.
Well,
I think.
But now, I've really gotten into the point where I'm sort of feeling boxed into a corner in the sense that...
You're tipping, aren't you? The other way.
Yeah, in the sense, George, that now, I try to pay close attention to what's going on inside of me, and now it's beginning to seem that when I try to say some other thing other than just what seems to be, namely that there does seem to be a state of existence after death, I feel inside like I'm running away from something or trying to rationalize rather than just to face what seems to be. So it really has tipped me over, along with some other stuff. There's a big background on this, but basically I think it's going to be very hard now to argue this case against this being connected somehow with an afterlife, because one of the signs of a weak argument, as you know, is from your interviewing experience, and which I know as a professor of logic and critical thinking, when somebody has a weak case, one sign of it is they shift their grounds on you. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take the position of a hypothetical scoffer, let's say, who looks at all this, and when they're confronted with the stories of the near-death experience, somebody who almost dies and returns, they say, oh, well, obviously that's the cut off of the oxygen flow to the brain. But then you say, well, what about the bystanders who have the same experience and yet they're not ill or injured? There's nothing wrong with their brain.
Good point.
Then they shift to psychological explanation, and they say, oh, they're just hysterical or emotional or wishful thinking or whatever. Well, that's not fair. That's a sign that somebody's case is weak. You see, like to shift grounds like that. So it's got to be, it's like it's not fair to make that kind of move, and so it's really pushing me toward saying, in effect, well, if it's not life after death, what is this? I mean, this is something really, really important that we need to take a look at.
And maybe we go back, Raymond, to where we began, in this hall of souls, just waiting to be born, and then here we are, and it goes back again. I don't know.
Well, that's certainly what Plato said, and in this, in many of his works. But he talks about that in the Republic. This warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield but revived talks about that very thing, about seeing people sort of lined up to be born. And this is a really exciting development, I think, because one thing, George, how conservative I am in inferences, but one thing I feel completely confident in saying is that in another 5 years' time, the whole debate about life after death, and I'm talking here about the rational debate, is going to look an entirely different way. I mean, there's things coming here that are just going to be very, very difficult to talk your way out of. It's beginning to look like to me within the next few years we're going to have, and I mean genuine, solid progress toward rational comprehension of this mystery of an afterlife.
All right, now let's bring in Dr. John Turner. John, let's react to some of this based on the things you've heard Raymond talk about.
Well, first of all, I have some interesting comments on that. This altered geometry. George, a year and a half ago when we talked, it was March 24th, and my small book had just come out, and I've learned so much since the publication of that book, George. The main thing I've learned is forgiveness, true forgiveness, but I've learned a lot of technical things. And I can say now that, I used to think the brain produced consciousness, and all through my training, medical school and then neurosurgery, and then in the years of practice, I would have always answered that question that way. The brain produces all that we know. But now I've changed, George. I've learned through many people who have studied this all their lives and all the study I've done that consciousness produces the brain. So I think we have to look at the brain much as we look at a radio receiver. And the fact that a radio produces the music doesn't mean that it generates the music. It simply interprets it. So since everything that we look at or we see now, George, as we look around, and Raymond, we're looking at our room here and whatever, is all a manifestation of energy. You'd have to agree with that. And the brain kind of keeps this in the form that it needs to be. It acts as a governor so we can go through these experiences we're here to do. But we're all in a field of consciousness. This whole thing is consciousness. And then it gets complicated with the parallel universes and all that. But I think this wavering of geometry has to do with the brain, losing some of that filtering effect to allow those things to happen. I think this bird's eye view when people leave their body has to do a lot with the fact that this is the way sometimes we see things in memory. We see it as a bird's eye view or a first-person view. But being in the corner of the room, my friend John Lerma once asked me, he said, Doctor, I think maybe the corner of the room has kind of a tetrahedron shape, and that power shape, dates back to the pyramids of Egypt and all those things. He's thinking, well, maybe that's why people find themselves in the corner of the room ready to go into this next dimension. So that's how I kind of react to the things Raymond has said. I think the shared experiences, though, to me, cannot be explained away by any activity of the brain other than perhaps the mirror neurons that Dr. Moody mentions in this book. This may allow someone who is really close to that patient, and as I recall, Raymond, it's the ones who are closest to the patient are the ones who really are able to experience this life review. But the fact that others, George and Raymond, who are not close to the patient, emotionally, like doctors.
Like
and
a
nurses,
doctor or
perhaps.
nurse, sure.
Yeah, they state that they see some of these things. So you can't write this off as just some connection with the patient. We've got to look at this to say, look, this obviously is another dimension. And Raymond describes in his great book these portals that open up into this light. And some of the respondents have said they've actually left their body with the person who's passing and have been told, no, this is not your time, and they can't go on. Just like the near-death experiencers who reach some type of a barrier, something that prevents them from going. And it's true, they're often given a choice, but usually there's some type of barrier. And maybe Raymond can elucidate this more.
Well, yes, and in connection with that, there's yet another kind of case that goes along with the shared death experience that raises some issues, I think, with the mirror neuron hypothesis, John, and that is that I hear lots of cases, too, of people who tell me that they were across town and or in another state, and suddenly they knew that their grandfather, for example, had just passed away. And later on received the news. I remember in the early 80s in Charlottesville, I took my kids to a basketball game, and the seat next to us was an acquaintance of ours who just happened to be in the next seat, and we started talking to our acquaintance, and she had this young man with her who was a relative of hers who was in his early 20s, and our acquaintance introduced him to me and mentioning the work I had done with near-death experiences. And then he brightened up and he told me this story about how several years earlier when he was 18 years old, just in the middle of the day, like suddenly he began to feel this out-of-body experience going up through a passageway into a light, and was totally baffled about this. And then, shortly thereafter, he found that his identical twin, who was obviously 18 also at that time, had several states away died at that very time. And there was no, this identical twin was not in any way ill, or well, this was just something that came out of the blue. So sometimes we can have these things that in which the spatial relationship or the spatial proximity doesn't seem to matter either.
What causes, Raymond, this connection?
I wish I knew. George, that is a real mystery. What is this? I mean, one thing that all of this causes me to realize is that these near-death experiences and shared death experiences are not necessarily related to the time-space framework that we exist in. And so then what do you say? Well, I think the two things I think are going to happen with the whole study of the afterlife, and I think this is going to be very quickly now. First of all, I think these shared death experiences like that Paul Perry and I describe in our new book, Glimpses of Eternity, that these shared death experiences now have to be taken into account in the same sort of way that we finally started taking into account near-death experiences. I mean, this is to a point now, George, where it carries its own verification. Mm-hmm. My philosophy in publishing a book is that I never publish anything until I'm absolutely sure that anybody who sincerely looks into it, in other words, any sincere investigation investigator who conducts their own research and looks around is going to be able to confirm it for themselves. Literally anybody who wants to know about this, especially somebody in the medical field, of course, or psychological field, but also just any ordinary person will be able, just by asking around in a sympathetic way among your own loved ones and friends, and will be able to find cases of these shared death experiences. Well, so we've got to own up to this in some way. So I think that's one thing, that the rise of these shared death experiences, which are existing now, I think, in enough numbers that anybody's going to be able to find plenty of cases of this. That is one thing. That's got to shift the framework of the debate, because we can't run away from that by saying, well, let's, brain damage caused by the oxygen flow being cut off. And then another thing that I think is going to happen is that I think that very soon now it's going to come out that there will be entirely new rational means of investigating the question of an afterlife. And I think specifically, George, what this is going to be is that, although this is probably a topic for another time, but basically just to sketch it out for you, I think I can assure you that there are ways to prepare people by opening up aspects of the mind that haven't been fully explored or that exist but are now sort of inhibited, and that by opening these up in people, this will prepare people who subsequently, just by chance, have a near-death experience to come back and articulate it in entirely new ways that get around this problem of ineffability. One of the most common things people with a near-death experience say is that no matter how articulate they may be, that they just have no words, that they find it impossible to describe the experience in ordinary words. Well, this is going to be greatly alleviated now by new developments that are going on in other areas of research. But basically, I think
did technology help that, Raymond?
I'm sorry?
Did technology move it along?
No, it's not exactly technology. Basically, I think that there are new forms of logic now that, and of course this is now just confined to a very small circle of maybe several hundred scholars and so on, but this is going to be emerging entirely new ways of logic that are going to not connected with the afterlife necessarily. It's just this is moving out now into the business community and into the sciences, and these new canons of logic or new systems of logic will greatly help investigating the question of life after death. But
we are at the top of the hour with Dr. Raymond Moody and John Turner. Dr. Moody's work, Glimpses of Eternity, and we'll be back with more on Coast to Coast AM.